Michael Baldwin, leave the Miracle Mansion packet closed.
That is ministry vision, not some street corner hustle.
You sold investments to church members for land that was never purchased.
There are two versions of Michael Mandel Baldwin. The assistant pastor his congregation trusted with their faith, and the man on the federal indictment who stole over $800,000 from that same congregation. Both are the same person.
People gave because they believed families needed something better.
Groundswell 73 was still a money pitch.
You're stripping the faith out of mission and calling it fraud.
He would not be leading the 7 a.m. choir rehearsal that Sunday. Agents from the United States Secret Service Charlotte Field Office had spent the better part of 2 years building the file that ended in the driveway of his Alexandria home. $800,000 raised, 12 years of solicitations, 5 states of victims, 2 churches connected by blood, and 1 Bible-themed amusement park that never broke ground on a single acre of Northern Virginia soil. By the time the grand jury returned the indictment, the assistant pastor of Crossroads Baptist had already been named the CEO of a company that existed almost entirely on paper. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever handed money to someone because you trusted them from church, from the pulpit, from the piano bench on Sunday morning? Drop a comment and tell me what happened. Subscribe if you are new here. We cover affinity fraud cases every week, and the ones that hurt worst are always the ones that begin inside a sanctuary. Michael Mandel Baldwin was born in the District of Columbia in 1969, the second son of a Southern Baptist minister who had migrated north from the Carolinas after the war to plant a church. His father, a man of 6 feet and a voice like an organ pipe, would eventually found Crossroads Baptist Church in Northern Virginia, a modest brick building on a corner lot with a gravel overflow parking area and a small illuminated cross above the double doors. Baldwin's older brother would inherit the pulpit. Baldwin himself would inherit the choir loft. Music came first. Before he could read the King James Version, he could pick out hymns on the upright piano in the fellowship hall. By the age of 9, he was playing offertory. By 14, he was directing the youth choir. Church elders called him a natural musician, a young man with the spirit in his fingers, and his mother kept a shoebox in the hall closet full of every program from every service he ever played. His high school music director in Alexandria wrote in his senior evaluation that Michael was gifted, dedicated, and possessed of a rare feel for gospel harmony, though he cautioned that the boy had a tendency to promise more than he could deliver. He attended a small, historically black college in the Mid-Atlantic on a partial music scholarship, studying voice and choral direction under a professor who had toured with a Motown backup group in the 70s. He graduated in 1991 with a bachelor's degree in music education and a plan to return home. He worked briefly as a substitute music teacher in the Alexandria Public Schools. He worked as a rehearsal accompanist for a community theater in Old Town. He worked as a session musician for a small gospel label recording out of a converted warehouse in Prince George's County, laying down keyboard parts for choirs who could not afford a full band. None of it paid enough to live on. His father called him home to Crossroads Baptist in 1996. The church needed a musical director. His brother was preparing to assume the senior pastorate. The 3 of them could run the church as a family, the father said, the way it was meant to be run. Baldwin accepted. His starting salary was $32,000 a year, plus a 2-bedroom parsonage apartment on the 2nd floor of the education wing. For the next decade, he built the music ministry. He recruited singers from the surrounding neighborhoods. He commissioned arrangements from an old classmate in Baltimore. He led an annual Christmas cantata that drew families from 3 counties. Congregation members remembered him standing at the electric keyboard on Sunday mornings, in a charcoal suit and a burgundy tie, his hands moving over the keys with a kind of unhurried confidence, his brother preaching behind him and his father in the front pew with a hand on his cane and his eyes closed. He married in 1998. 2 sons followed, one in 2000 and one in 2003. His wife taught 4th grade at a public elementary school across the river in Prince George's County. On weekends, the family sat together in the 2nd pew from the front. The boys wore clip-on ties. The wife carried a leather-bound Bible with her name embossed in gold on the cover. Baldwin's mother sat beside her. His father, until his health began to fail, would still stand for the doxology. In 2004, his brother formally ordained him as assistant pastor. It was a family transition as much as a ministerial one. Baldwin now preached one Sunday a month, conducted weddings and funerals, sat on the deacon board, and represented Crossroads at pastors' conferences up and down the East Coast. He met other clergy at those conferences. He built relationships. He traded phone numbers. He was invited to guest preach at partner congregations in Maryland, in North Carolina, in Georgia. One of those relationships would matter more than the others. A pastor from a mid-sized Baptist congregation outside Charlotte, North Carolina, met Baldwin at a leadership retreat in 2007. The two men prayed together in a hotel prayer room after the closing session. They exchanged home addresses on the back of a program. They became friends in the way that two clergymen with adjacent territories often become friends, which is to say, slowly, over long dinners, with a Bible on the table between them, and a running argument about the correct interpretation of the book of Acts. That pastor would eventually be the first identified victim. By 2008, Baldwin was 40 years old, a fixture in his father's church, married with two adolescent sons, and quietly restless. His salary had grown to $51,000. His music ministry was thriving. His pastoral duties were expanding. But he had begun to talk to his wife and to his closer friends in the ministry about a bigger vision, something for the whole family, something with a kingdom purpose, something, as he would later describe it in a promotional brochure, that would reshape the face of family entertainment in the Washington metropolitan region. He was going to build a Bible theme park. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the specific mechanics of affinity fraud inside a church. A church is not a bank. A church is not a licensed broker-dealer. A church is not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. When a congregation gathers on a Sunday morning, the people in the pews are not applying the same skepticism they would apply to a cold call from a Delaware LLC. They are singing together. They are praying together. They are giving to a tithe basket that gets passed down the aisle by a deacon whose children they have known since kindergarten. The whole architecture of the room is built around the assumption that the people up front are trustworthy. Affinity fraud is what happens when someone at the front of the room monetizes that assumption. The federal statutes on affinity fraud are the same statutes that cover any securities fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, interstate solicitation of investment on the basis of material misrepresentations, maximum sentences of 20 years per count. What makes affinity fraud legally distinctive is not the statute. It is the trust framework the fraudster exploits to get the money in the first place. At Crossroads Baptist, the trust framework was not abstract. It was inherited. The founder of the church was Baldwin's father. The senior pastor of the church was Baldwin's brother. When Baldwin sat down across a table from a congregation member and described an investment opportunity, he was doing so with the full weight of a family that had built the sanctuary the congregation member was praying in. His last name was on the historical plaque in the vestibule. His father had baptized their children. His brother had counseled them through their divorces. He had played the piano at their weddings and at their parents' funerals. That was the vulnerability. There is no board of directors at a small Baptist church that vets the outside business dealings of the assistant pastor. There is no fiduciary policy that requires the disclosure of pitches made to congregation members over Sunday lunch. There is no compliance officer reviewing the pastor's second job. In most congregations, the very idea of such oversight would be considered offensive to the culture of trust the church is built on. The system does not check because the system is not designed to check. Federal prosecutors would later describe this vulnerability in unusually direct language. They would write in their sentencing memorandum that Baldwin had preyed on his victims' religious affiliations, their charitable inclinations, and their trust in the defendant as a friend and religious advisor. They would argue that he had inflicted emotional and spiritual harm on his victims. Federal prosecutors do not typically use the word spiritual in sentencing memoranda. They used it here because the harm was not only financial, it was the destruction of the trust architecture that had given the churches their reason for existing. Baldwin knew all of this. He had lived inside that architecture his entire life. He knew exactly how much it could hold. In 2009, Baldwin incorporated Miracle Mansion, LLC, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He listed himself as Chief Executive Officer. The stated purpose of the company was the development of a Bible-themed family entertainment complex to be constructed somewhere in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. No specific site was identified. No architect was retained. No zoning application was filed with any county planning commission. The company existed as a name on a certificate of incorporation, a business checking account at a regional bank, and a promotional folder that Baldwin began carrying with him to pastors' conferences. The folder was the operation. Inside the folder were glossy renderings of a park that did not exist. Artist concepts of a Noah's Ark walk-through attraction. A drawing of a tower meant to evoke the Tower of Babel. A rendering of a first-century Judean marketplace with costumed reenactors selling loaves of bread. A conceptual site plan showing parking for 4,000 vehicles. Baldwin had commissioned the renderings from a small design firm in Richmond and paid for them out of pocket. They were beautiful. They were also, in the strictest sense, fiction. The pitch document described Miracle Mansion, in Baldwin's own written language, as a one-of-a-kind entertainment complex that would reshape the face of family entertainment in the Washington metropolitan region. Its mission, the document said, was to promote family-focused inspiration, entertainment, and enrichment anchored by a biblical worldview. It was written in the exact vocabulary that would resonate with a Baptist deacon evaluating an investment opportunity. The signature offering was called Groundswell 73. The structure was, as Baldwin liked to explain it in meetings, biblically inspired. 73 acres of land, 7,300 people, each person investing $73 a month for 73 months. He would stand at a whiteboard in a hotel conference room and write out the numbers in blue marker. He would circle the sevens. He would explain that the sevens were not accidental. The number 7, he would say, was the number of completion in Scripture. 3 was the number of the Trinity. 73 was the two of them together, a covenant number, a number that carried the weight of the whole biblical narrative. The congregation members in the room would nod. The pastors in the room would nod. It sounded like theology. It was numerology dressed up as a business plan. The first solicitation Baldwin made under the Miracle Mansion umbrella went to the Charlotte area pastor he had befriended at the 2007 leadership retreat. Baldwin flew to Charlotte in the summer of 2010, brought his folder, laid out the renderings on the pastor's dining room table over a plate of pound cake, and asked for a personal investment, plus an introduction to the pastor's congregation. The pastor invested $9,000. The pastor made the introduction the following Sunday morning from his own pulpit. Baldwin left North Carolina with a signed pledge, a handshake, and the phone numbers of 6 deacons. Over the next 11 years, Baldwin repeated that pattern. He solicited from Crossroads Baptist members in Alexandria. He solicited from partner churches in Arlington and Fairfax County. He drove to congregations in Little Rock and Jonesboro. He preached at a small church in Jacksonville and stayed after the service to talk to families. He returned to the Charlotte area a dozen times. He drove down I-95 to congregations outside Savannah and up I-85 to congregations outside Atlanta. He preached in some of those churches. He played piano in others. Every service was a soft opening. Every prayer breakfast was a lead generation event. And in every meeting, he named the endorsements. He would sit down across from a potential investor. He would open the folder. He would explain that Miracle Mansion had support at the highest levels of the American Christian corporate community. He would name the Kennedy Center. He would name Hobby Lobby. He would name Chick-fil-A. He would say that executives at those companies had reviewed the project. He would say that they had expressed support. He would say, in some meetings, that specific individuals whose names would later appear on federal witness lists had personally endorsed the concept. None of it was true. The Kennedy Center had never heard of Miracle Mansion. Hobby Lobby had never heard of Miracle Mansion. Chick-fil-A had never heard of Miracle Mansion. The executives Baldwin named had never met him. They had never seen his brochure. They had never been asked to endorse anything. But their names were the reason the deals closed. A Baptist deacon in North Carolina, who might have hesitated at investing $73 a month for 6 years in a Bible theme park, was significantly less hesitant when the assistant pastor sitting across from him mentioned that the CEO of a Fortune 500 Christian retail chain was already on board. A widowed schoolteacher in Little Rock, who had never made an investment larger than a savings bond, was significantly less hesitant when the visiting preacher told her that the Kennedy Center itself had blessed the project. Over more than a decade, more than $800,000 flowed into Miracle Mansion accounts from congregation members and pastors and small Baptist congregations across Virginia, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. Almost none of it went toward building anything. Bank records that federal investigators would eventually obtain showed the pattern. Personal expenses. Travel that had no relationship to any theme park site visit. Meals at restaurants in Alexandria and Washington, and at steakhouses on the outskirts of every city he preached in. Credit card payments on personal accounts. Cash withdrawals in amounts calibrated to fall below currency transaction reporting thresholds. No land was purchased. No architect was retained. No engineering study was commissioned. The 73 acres that were supposed to become the foundation of the project were, throughout the entire 12-year run, a rhetorical device rather than a real estate holding. By 2018, the earlier investors were starting to ask questions. Where was the land? When was the groundbreaking? Could they see a site plan? Baldwin, who had by then raised well into 6 figures, did what fraud operators throughout the history of American investment schemes have done in that situation. He used the newer money to pay off the older money. He wired partial returns to the loudest complainers. He described the payments as early distributions from an accelerated fundraising round. He kept the pattern running. That is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. And by 2020, that is what Miracle Mansion had become. We are about to walk into the federal investigation. Before we do, if this case is making you angry, put that in the comments. Subscribe if you want to see more of how the system actually catches people who hide behind a pulpit. This channel does not let these stories get buried. The catalyst was the Charlotte pastor. He had been Baldwin's first identified victim. He had invested his own money. He had introduced Baldwin to his congregation from his own pulpit. He had, over 11 years, watched dozens of families in his church put money into Miracle Mansion on his personal recommendation. And by early 2021, he had begun to accept what the pattern of unanswered questions and hedged emails and rescheduled site visits meant. There was no theme park. There was never going to be a theme park. He drove to the field office of the United States Secret Service in Charlotte in the spring of 2021 and asked to speak with an agent about a potential securities fraud matter involving a Virginia-based developer. The intake agent took his statement. The file was routed to the Financial Crimes Task Force. Special Agent in charge, Jason Burns, was briefed within a week. The Secret Service is not only responsible for presidential protection, it also carries jurisdiction over a specific category of federal financial crimes, including wire fraud that crosses state lines and involves the movement of funds through the banking system. Miracle Mansion, with its 5-state solicitation footprint and its interstate wire transfers, was squarely inside that jurisdiction. Special Agent Burns assigned the case to a 2-agent team. The team began the investigation by doing exactly what an experienced fraud investigator does at the start of a case of this size. They pulled the corporate records from the Virginia State Corporation Commission. They subpoenaed the Miracle Mansion bank accounts. They obtained every version of the promotional folder Baldwin had ever mailed to a potential investor. They interviewed the Charlotte pastor for 2 full days and asked him for the names of every other person he knew who had invested. That list, when it was complete, ran to more than 40 individuals across 5 states. Over the summer of 2021, the 2 agents traveled. They interviewed pastors in Charlotte and Fayetteville. They interviewed a widowed schoolteacher in Little Rock who had invested her late husband's life insurance settlement. They interviewed a barber in Jacksonville who had put in $14,000 over 3 years, $73 a month, every month, without missing a payment. They interviewed a retired postal worker in suburban Atlanta who had funneled her Christmas Club savings into Miracle Mansion for 6 consecutive years. Every interview added a name. Every name added a bank record. Every bank record added a wire transfer. The paper trail was extensive, well documented, and, from a prosecutorial standpoint, unusually clean. And then the investigators turned to the endorsements. The endorsements were the smoking gun. Baldwin, in his solicitations, had done something that most experienced fraud operators would never do. He had named specific institutions, not vague gestures at corporate support, not implied relationships with unnamed executives, specific, named, verifiable institutions, the Kennedy Center, Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A. He had told potential investors that executives at those companies had endorsed Miracle Mansion. That kind of claim is trivially easy for a federal investigator to falsify. Special Agent Burns's team wrote formal inquiries to the Office of the General Counsel at each of the 3 institutions. They attached copies of Baldwin's promotional materials. They attached transcribed statements from investors describing what Baldwin had said in the solicitation meetings. They asked, in the plain language of a federal investigation, whether the institution had any record of any relationship with Michael Mandel Baldwin or Miracle Mansion, LLC. The responses came back within weeks. The Kennedy Center had no record, no correspondence, no meetings, no knowledge of the project or the man. Hobby Lobby had no record. The executives Baldwin had named by name had never met him. Corporate counsel confirmed in writing that no endorsement had been given, requested, or discussed. Chick-fil-A had no record. Same result. Same written confirmation. The prosecution now had documentary proof of a material misrepresentation made to investors across 5 states over the course of a decade. That was the wire fraud count. That was the securities fraud count. That was the case. By September of 2021, the file had grown to more than a dozen bankers' boxes. Assistant United States Attorneys Corinne Finley and Kenneth Smith, working out of the Western District of North Carolina under U.S. Attorney Dina J. King, took the case to the grand jury. The grand jury voted to indict on both counts. The indictment was sealed for 2 weeks while the arrest logistics were finalized. On the morning of the arrest, Baldwin was at home in Alexandria. He had led choir rehearsal the previous Sunday. He was scheduled to preach the coming Sunday. He was, by every external measure, still the assistant pastor and musical director of Crossroads Baptist Church. At approximately 7:15 a.m., federal agents from the Secret Service Washington Field Office, acting on a warrant from the Western District of North Carolina, approached his front door. The lead agent knocked. Baldwin answered in a robe and slippers. Behind him, a coffee maker was running in the kitchen. His wife stood at the top of the stairs, still in a bathrobe. His younger son, home from college, had come out of a bedroom in the hallway and stopped in the corridor with a phone in his hand. The lead agent introduced himself. "Mr. Baldwin, I have a federal arrest warrant for you out of the Western District of North Carolina. The charges are wire fraud and securities fraud. I need you to step outside, sir." Baldwin looked at the warrant. He looked at the 2 agents standing on his porch. He looked back into his own kitchen. Wire fraud. "Yes, sir. For what?" "For Miracle Mansion, sir. We need you to step outside." Baldwin was silent for what one agent later described in his report as approximately 12 seconds. He asked whether he could put on clothes. The agents told him he could, that they would accompany him to his bedroom, and that he would need to leave his phone on the counter. He complied. He dressed in a gray sweatshirt and jeans and a pair of loafers with no socks. He walked back to the front door. At the doorway, he turned to his wife. "I need you to call the church. Tell them I will not be at rehearsal Sunday." His wife did not answer. He was walked to a vehicle at the curb. He was cuffed at the vehicle, not on the porch, at the discretion of the lead agent, who had judged the family situation to warrant a less visible arrest. He was placed in the rear seat. He asked for his attorney's name. He did not speak again for the duration of the transport. His last words to his colleagues at Crossroads Baptist Church were relayed through his wife on a phone call she made from the front porch after the vehicle had pulled away. He would not be at rehearsal Sunday. The trial began in November of 2022 in the federal courthouse for the Western District of North Carolina. Assistant United States Attorneys Corinne Finley and Kenneth Smith presented the government's case over the course of a 2-week trial. They called more than 20 witnesses. They called the Charlotte pastor. They called the widowed schoolteacher from Little Rock. They called the barber from Jacksonville. They called the retired postal worker from suburban Atlanta. Each of them described a version of the same story. The pastor at the pulpit, the folder on the table, the renderings, the groundswell 73 numbers on a whiteboard, the names of the endorsers, and then the prosecution called the endorsers. A senior executive from Hobby Lobby took the stand and testified, under oath, that he had never met Michael Mandel Baldwin, had never reviewed the Miracle Mansion project, and had never endorsed it in any form. A senior executive from Chick-fil-A took the stand and gave the same testimony. A representative of the Kennedy Center gave the same testimony. Each witness sat in the box for less than an hour. Each one, in the plainest possible language, contradicted a specific claim Baldwin had made in a specific solicitation meeting to a specific victim. Baldwin's defense attorney argued that his client had believed in the project, had intended to build it, had misspoken about the endorsements out of enthusiasm rather than intent to deceive. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict came back guilty on both counts. Sentencing was set for August of 2024. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecution filed a memorandum that federal courtroom observers described as unusually pointed. Baldwin, the memorandum said, had preyed on his victims' religious affiliations, their charitable inclinations, and their trust in the defendant as a friend and religious advisor. He had inflicted emotional and spiritual harm on his victims that would extend far beyond the recovery of any restitution. Several victims spoke. The widowed schoolteacher from Little Rock spoke about the life insurance settlement she had invested and the retirement she had planned around it. The barber from Jacksonville spoke about the $14,000 he had put in one $73 payment at a time. The Charlotte pastor spoke last. He said, standing at the podium in the front of the courtroom, that he had introduced Michael Baldwin to his congregation as a man of God, and that he would carry the weight of that introduction for the rest of his life. The United States Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina, Dina J. King, issued a written statement following the conviction. Baldwin's Miracle Mansion, she wrote, was a house of lies. Using biblical themes and empty promises to cover up the fraud, Baldwin had engaged in an extensive scheme